All right, so this is going to be an assembly video for the Chimera electric BMX. And what I've got in front of us now are three things that you must have in order to accomplish this assembly, and one thing that it's going to be really good to have. So the first thing that you must have in order to assemble the bike is a metric Allen wrench set. You can pick these up pretty cheap from Amazon or your local hardware store. You don't need anything fancy. The second thing you must have is a Torx size T25 wrench. Now, once we open up this box, there's going to be a lot of packaging and zip ties holding things together. Technically, all you need to get through that stuff is something sharp. So for that, a box cutter will work pretty well. However, although this is good for getting through packaging and tape, when you start cutting zip ties, you run the risk of cutting into the bike or a tire or something like that. And I find that it's really good to have a pair of wire cutters for the zip ties and save the razor blade for the packaging. All right, with all that being said, these are the only things you need. So we're gonna open up this box and I'm gonna show you how to assemble this bike. All right, so I've gone ahead and gotten the top flaps of the box open. And once you've done that, you can remove this top protective layer of cardboard and set it aside. You'll immediately see that the wheels are zip tied together to keep them from shifting during transit. That's where the wire cutters come in handy. You can just snip and don't have to worry, as you would with a razor blade, that you might cut the tire. You'll also notice that the bolts for the hubs are taped in little baggies onto the wheels. Don't take them off just yet. Instead, just go ahead and grab the wheels and set them to the side. Now, remove this next layer of cardboard, and there's your bike. This can be pulled right out, and once it is, you can go ahead and start removing all of the protective plastic. Like I say, you might need a razor blade to get through some of the later stages. For the moment, what I want to call attention to, the chain is also zip tied with some protective wrapping. Leave that alone for the moment. We'll get to that eventually. Other than that, you can go ahead and unwrap the rest of the packaging. Just keep in mind that the brake cables are connected onto the handlebars here. So if you're cutting with a razor blade, make sure not to cut into them. And of course, you can't pull the handlebars away from the frame too far. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and unwrap the rest of this and then set it up on a table. All right, so I've got the bike completely unwrapped. The packaging material is off of it except for the zip tie holding the chain on. That's going to enable us to assemble the bike without the chain sort of hanging free and getting oil everywhere. The wheels over there in the background, the pedals off to the side, and then of course the tools we need to assemble everything. Now I know some of you are going to have a bike stand, and if you do, you're welcome to hang the bike from the seat tube and carry out the assembly step by step as I do here, but you don't need a bike stand to assemble this bike. You can use a table as I'm doing now, or you can use the floor. If you're going to use a table or a floor, another item that came with your bike is going to come in handy for our very first step, which is the charger. You can leave it in the box, and what we're going to do is we're going to put this bike upright in order to install the handlebars, and we're going to use this charger so that the bottom bracket can sit on it so the sprocket over there doesn't lean on the table. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So you can see how I've got the bike set up here with the bottom bracket sitting on top of the charger. Don't worry, the bike is not heavy enough to crush that box. But it does enable us to get that sprocket off of the table or the floor so the bike can be perfectly vertical for us to work on it. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take these bolts out and pull this cap off the stem so that I can put the handlebars on. Let me show you how to do that. All right, so in order to get this stem cap off, you're going to need a 6mm wrench. That's going to work for both the stem cap bolts and the bolts over here that attach the stem to the steerer tube. Now these bolts aren't going to be on very tight, so you should be able to just twist them off as I'm going to do now. Okay, now that I've got my stem cap off, I'm going to grab my handlebars, and what I want to do is I want to make sure that the brake cable that's coming out of the steer tube is going over here to the left. If you're sitting on the bike, it will be your left. It's, you know, since we're in front, it's on our right from our perspective. But if you were sitting on the bike, it would be your left hand. And I want to make sure that the brake cable that's going to the rear of the bike is set up for the right hand, which from our perspective is over here on the left. Now, some of you might want to later switch those brakes around. That's perfectly fine, but for the moment, that's how they're oriented when the bike comes. So that's how you want to put on your handlebars so that they're in the right direction. Now, you want this roughly centered in the stem. The orientation in terms of like forward and backward doesn't matter too much for the moment. You just want to make sure that's centered so that you don't sort of put the stem cap on one of these curves. All right. So now that I've got my handlebars roughly centered, I'm just going to take my bolts and by hand sort of get them started. Okay, now that they're started, I'm going to go ahead and twist them back with very little tension, basically just enough to keep the handlebars upright. And then I'm going to change camera positions to show you the way BMX handlebars are traditionally set up, at least for your first ride. So I know some of you have been riding BMX for quite some time, and if you have, then you already know sort of where you want your bars lined up. But if you haven't ridden BMX in a while, or you've never ridden BMX, the most common way to line these bars up is sort of at the same angle as your forks. So you can see, I'm looking at it from the side here, and I've got it roughly in line. And once it's in line, you can go ahead and tension each of these bolts. Now, I want to zoom in just a little bit here to show you that once you start to adjust this stem cap and tighten it down, you want to make sure that the gap all the way around, the gap here, here, and over here, is roughly the same gap. You don't want the stem cap to sort of skew so that the gap is small here and big here. You want them to be roughly even all around. Now, you don't have to get too meticulous about this. You don't have to break out the ruler or anything. You can do it by eye, but as long as they're roughly equal, you're good. And if you're not, you run the risk of messing up your bolts. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get these tighter. Now, if you think you're going to adjust this later for your first ride, you don't have to tighten it all the way down. You just need to get it tight enough so that these aren't going to move when you turn the bike upside down. But most of you, I think, are going to be happy with this bar position, which means that you can go ahead and tighten these bolts down. All right, so now that we've got the handlebars on, one thing I should mention is that these brake levers are shipped not tight. They are not yet adjusted on the handlebars. And one thing you might do is go ahead and get them in roughly the position that you want them and tighten them down. You can always save that step for later, for when you first get on the bike. Just don't forget to do it because you don't want to be riding and have them loose. Now that I've got the handlebars on and as tight as they need to be, I'm going to flip the bike upside down. And then once I do, I'll take that charger box and sort of put it to the side, but it will come in handy again in one of the final steps of the assembly. All right, so the next step is to mount the brake caliper onto the fork. And to do that, I'm going to first pull these two bolts out. They should be loose enough to twist by hand. But if they aren't, you can use the Torx T25 wrench that we're going to need to put this on. Now you might need to pull the brake cable up a bit. You can do that, there's plenty of slack. And when you do, you can put each of the bolts through, and then need a little more slack here. You can line up and get both of them started. And then once they're started, you can go ahead and bolt them all the way on. Make sure to go ahead and snug them up. Again, if you need to, you can check the torque specs on the website, but if you've been building bikes for a while, you kind of know where they need to be. The next step is to take this front wheel and mount it to the front forks. To get that started, I'm going to go ahead and take this bag off of the spokes and get those bolts out. First thing I want to do is get these bolts started on both sides of the wheel, leaving plenty of threads so that this wheel can be dropped into the front fork. All right, let me move the camera and I'll show you how that's done. All right, so now that we've got our wheel ready to drop into the forks, we're gonna take these little plastic protectors out of that front brake, and we're gonna make sure when we drop the wheel in that our rotor aligns with the brake first, and then we can make sure that our washers are on the outside of the forks here and drop it right in. Okay, now that it's in, what we want to use is an 8mm wrench. This works for both the back wheel and front wheel bolts. Okay, now that we've got the front wheel on and the bolts tightened down, we want to check the alignment of the brake. Now, we do the best we can before we put the bike into the box that these brakes are aligned, but they're pretty tricky. So when you spin the wheel, you might hear it rub just a touch. Now what you want to do is, let me see if I can show you. You want to get your Torx T25 wrench and loosen just enough on both sides here, on each of these bolts, so that you can now pivot and find the best spot, which I think is somewhere around there, and sort of you can hold it in place. Now, I encourage you, since you've got these nice brakes on your bike, to go ahead and watch alignment videos by Magura. There we go. And they can give you all the tips and tricks on how to bleed the brakes, adjust the brakes, replace the brake pads. All right, so now we're ready to snip the zip tie or zip ties holding the chain on. And you want to unravel it and make sure that it hangs free, sort of not tangled at all. And now that we've got that in place, we can now take these bolts off of the rear wheel out of this bag, but don't put the bolts onto the rear wheel just yet. We actually want to attach the chain first. Let me show you how. To make that process easier, let's go ahead and put the charger box back underneath the seat. That's going to give us enough room to get the wheel on without it dragging against the floor or table, whichever one you're doing. All right, so go ahead and slide out that plastic protector from the Magura brake. Grab the wheel with one hand and your chain with the other. And before you slide the rotor into the brake pad there, go ahead and wrap the chain around this portion of the hub. And now you can go ahead and drop the rotor in, you see back there, into the brake pad. And you should be able to slide this forward enough that you can wrap the chain all the way around the sprocket very easily. Now notice if we had the bolts in, the chain tension would have been much tighter and it would have been harder to do that. But since we left the bolts out, we've got all this room to put our chain on. At this point, you should take a moment to check out the funny looking washers that are on the bolts that we provided for your rear wheel. These are actually chain tensioners made by Alienation BMX. Shout out to Alienation for getting these to us. They're great. And the way these work is that these cutouts slide into the dropout and push against the furthest point on the dropout to get just the right tension so that the rear wheel will never slide forward no matter how much torque that motor puts on it. Now, each of these washers has two sizes of spacing to push against that point in the dropout. And you'll know what they are because Alienation prints the two sizes here on the chain tensioner. This one is a 3.5 millimeter on one side, the side without the dot, and the larger number, the 4 millimeter, is the side with the dot. Now we go ahead and write the size that you need on the bag. But even if, I don't know, if you cut through it with a razor blade or it wore off, it doesn't matter because you can figure out very quickly which size you need as you're putting these bolts on. So let me show you how to do that. The first thing you want to do is just get these bolts started. You can do that by hand, and you don't have to worry about sliding in the chain tensioner just yet. All right, so now that I've got the bolts started, I'm going to look to see which side of the chain tensioner I need to slide into the dropout there. Now remember, for this particular bike, I need the larger number, which means I'm going to use the side that has the dot on it. So if I'm in good lighting, I can look and I can see that there's the dot on this side. And I'll go ahead and get that at least tight enough so it won't come loose. And then let me look on this side. Okay, you can see there's the dot, and that's what I need to slide into the dropout there before tightening. All right, because I've got these chain tensioners in there, I don't need this bolt to be incredibly tight, but still I'm going to go ahead and tension it enough so that I can be sure that it won't come loose. I think I've got both sides at that tension. All right, our rear wheel is on, but as before, we want to check to see if that brake is in alignment. This one happens to be in alignment, but if it's not and you hear a little bit of rub, you can spend a couple minutes, sometimes it might take you 20 or 30 minutes, to get that brake in alignment in exactly the way I did with the front forks. All right, now it's time to put on the pedals, and it's important that you know that on bikes, the right crank arm, the crank arm with the sprocket on it, has traditional threads, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. But the left crank arm, the crank arm without the sprocket on it, has reverse threads so that the pedal doesn't come loose while you're pedaling. So that one's going to be lefty-tighty, righty-loosey. And you'll know which pedal to grab because they have printed on them. See, this one is right, and this one is left. You can find the L. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my right pedal and I'm going to use a 6 millimeter wrench, and the Allen key is here on the end of the shaft. So I'll get it there, and I will make sure that I'm threading in a way that twists in that direction, in the clockwise direction if I'm looking this way. Now, the crank arms, especially if you get the titanium crank arms, they're going to be a little tight. And so you might not be able to do, as I've been doing with these other bolts where I sort of go long ways and just twist with my fingers. You might have to get in here and really crank down. And if you hit a really tough spot, what you can do is you get it as far as it'll go, you back off a little bit, and you go again, and eventually you will get these pedals on. Okay, one thing you can do to keep yourself from getting confused with this reverse threading is when you're putting on the left pedal, stay on this side of the bike, the side with the sprocket. And the reason I say to do that is because you're coming to the pedal from the opposite side. That means when you turn clockwise, when you turn righty, you're actually turning lefty on the other side. So what that means is that you can turn the way you usually turn, clockwise, and you're still reverse threading the pedal in. All right, at this point, we're actually done with all of the mechanical work there is to do for assembling the bike, and now we need to move on to the electrical. Now, the first thing that we're gonna do on the electrical is connect this throttle. This throttle wire has a particular orientation, so let me zoom in and show you a close-up. So this is a 3-pin throttle cable. It's a Gillette brand, but these are pretty common in the e-bike world. And what you can see is when you look, you see that there's like a little guide there, and you want to line that up, right, to make sure that when you put it in, there we go, there's a nice little snap and the logos match. There's even these little arrows here that show you those need to align as well. Now, before you go any further, it is very important to check this button on the back of your battery. When it is pressed in, your battery is off. When it is pressed out, your battery is on. And you always want your battery in the off position whenever you're making any connections, whether you're connecting or disconnecting the battery from the bike itself, or you're connecting or disconnecting a charger. Now for that, I'll turn the camera and show you the two connections that you have. The larger one is an XT90. This is the one we're going to use to connect to the bike. The other connector, the smaller one, is an XT60. This is the one you're going to use to connect to a charger. Okay, now with that being said, I'm going to turn the camera around and get a good angle so that you can see how to connect this XT90 to the bike itself. All right, so now that the camera is on this side of the bike, you can see the male XT90 connector that goes to the motor controller, and that's what you want to use to connect to the female connector that goes to your battery. You'll notice that the connector is shaped in such a way where you can only orient it to one side. It slides in with a little bit of resistance, but I'll just let you know that if you ever need to disconnect it, it's actually pretty firm, and you always want to make sure to never pull by the wires, but you want to pull by the connector itself, which is a little tricky, but just be patient. There we go. And make sure to always pull from the connector, otherwise you risk pulling the wire out. All right, so at this point, your bike is fully assembled and you should be ready to run a test. But before you do, I want you to make sure that your rear wheel can roll smoothly without hitting the floor or a wall or getting one of your kids' arms stuck in it. Make sure nothing is in its way. And once you've made sure that your rear wheel can roll smoothly without posing any danger to anyone, you can now turn your bike on by hitting that battery button. That's the way you're going to turn your bike on and off from now on. Once you've turned that battery button on, your bike engages within about a second. So it is now ready to go. And when you go over here to your trigger throttle, it should accelerate the bike. Now, that's an exciting moment for you, but don't get on the bike and start riding just yet, because there's still a few things you need to do, and I'm going to walk you through them now. So there are still a few more things you need to do before you can take your first ride. One is that you need to pump up these tires. I recommend around 60 psi. If you're running Tubolito tubes, you can go as high as 65. If you're running rubber tubes, you can go all the way up to 80 psi. The next thing you need to do is you need to charge your battery. We ship these at around 49 volts, and that's below nominal. So that means that if you get on your bike and you try to throttle it, it's probably going to cut out pretty quickly. Now I've gone ahead and connected the charger via the XT60 connector that I talked about. Once you're connected, you can turn the battery on, and if you're running the stock charger, it'll immediately start charging. If you're running our variable charger, it has this cool little on-off switch. When I turn it on, it has a readout that'll tell you what your voltage is and what current you're charging at. You can see we ship these at around 49 volts. If you're charging at 1 amp, that's going to be a slow charge. That's best for your battery in the long term. But if you want a quick charge, you can go all the way up to 5 amps, and that'll actually go from 0 to a full battery in about 45 minutes, which is pretty cool. So those are the things that you need to do to get the bike ready to ride. But now there's a couple things you need to do to get yourself ready to ride, and one of them is getting a helmet and wearing it. This bike, as you know, accelerates very quickly and it gets to high top speeds, 35 mile per hour plus. That makes it a dangerous vehicle, and not wearing your helmet on a vehicle like that is just dumb. Can't stress this enough, you have to wear your helmet. Another thing you need to prepare yourself for is that the bike, when you first get on it, is not going to stop very easily. And that's because hydraulic brakes like this take time to bed in. In order to bed in your brakes, you want to get the bike up to a moderate speed in an area where you don't need to stop quickly, and you will stop slowly by easing on the brakes. You'll do that over and over again, going to a moderate speed and easing to a full stop. Eventually, oftentimes a few hours, but sometimes even days, you will bed in the brakes in a way where they will stop on a dime. These Maguros are actually very powerful once you get them bedded in. But until that time, if you accelerate this bike up to 35 miles per hour when you first get on it, really hope you don't have to stop quickly, and I really hope you're wearing your helmet, because otherwise it's your funeral. The last thing I'll remind you of is to check your handlebar position and brake position and throttle position as well, to get all that adjusted the way you like it, and make sure all the bolts are tight enough where there's no slipping on any of those components. Okay, once you've got all that in place, you got your helmet on, you get your brakes bedded in. I really hope you enjoy this bike. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns. Can't wait to see what you guys think of this thing.